Hello and welcome to another 140k Imperial Guard Tactics video. Now before we get into today's video, I would like to say a huge thank you to James for sending in some awesome pictures of his Traitor Guard force. I am a real sucker for a well done Traitor Guard force. I mean, I myself am a staunch three-armed loyal servant of the Emperor, but I can really appreciate how cool a proper Traitor Guard army is. And this is a very cool Traitor Guard army. I've often thought that it would be a good idea for me to get a Traitor Guard army for the channels, that when we do, because often my battle reports end up being Imperium on Imperium, but if I've got a Traitor Guard force, I can use Guard as much as I want, and it's not Imperium versus Imperium anymore, technically, right? I'm kind of thinking that might be a route I've got to explore in the future. But anyway, thank you for sending these pictures in, James. They look absolutely fantastic. And anyone else has got any cool pictures they want me to use in my videos, please post them on my Facebook page or email them to me at mordianglorytv@gmail.com. And don't worry, if you can't remember that, there will be the email address down the description below, along with a link to the Facebook page as well. But without further ado, let's get into today's video. So what I want to touch upon today, guys, is regular guard versus Scions. And I've been smashing it with my Scions recently. I've gone to 3 events with them. I've got another one lined up with my Scions next weekend as well. Just going to continue on the Scion train for a little bit longer. And one of the questions that I've been getting on my recent sort of more Scion-focused content is, well, are you not doing regular guard anymore? Or do you think that Scions are better than, you know, standard Imperial Guard? And it's a really tough question. I mean, my instinct is to be like, no, of course, regular guard are better. Because, you know, I like regular guard. I'm a Mordian guard player. But I can't really deny what's in front of my face at the moment, which is that I am finding it easier to be more competitive with my Scions than I am with my regular guard. And by regular guard, I'm talking a hybrid Astra Militarum force. Now, there are guard players out there which are better than me. You know, I consider myself to be a fairly middle of the road player. And there are people who are able to take certain guard lists and they're able to read the terrain and do the revision before the tournament and all this kind of stuff. And they're able to go, you know, 3 and 2 or 4 with the regular guard force. But for myself as an average player, I tend to find that I'm leaning more towards Scion. That I'm able to win easier with my Scions. And there's a number of reasons for that, guys. Now, the first thing I would say is that Scions are more tactically flexible. Okay? They can operate, they've just got absolutely blistering firepower, and they're really maneuverable. And when you've just got an army-wide Blitzkrieg 3+, and your standard vehicle is pumping out all the anti-infantry that you need, and your infantry are pumping out all the anti-tank that you need, you know, it just seems to work really well. And I think the reason why the Scions just feel solid at the moment is because it's almost like you've got the agony of choice taken away. With your regular guard stuff, there's so many different choices of unit, which is good. I don't want games to take away unit choices from me, but there's so many different unit choices that it can sometimes you end up taking things that aren't quite as efficient just because you like them. Whereas with Scions, it's like, well, okay, I've only got like 3 choices. I've got an HQ, I've got an infantry squad that can either be a command squad or an infantry squad, and I've got a Torx Prime. And that's basically all I've got. And so it's very difficult for me to really, you know, take inefficient choices. I just take Scions with Plasma or Melter and I'm having a good time. That's basically how you do it. And I'm just taking Torx Primes, you know. And if you just follow that as a golden rule, you know, Melter and Plasma and Dakar Primes, and you just basically copy and paste that as much as possible, you follow those rules, you're going to have a solid Scion force. And that's easy to get your head around. That's easy to build a list based on that. If you just go into your list building and you're like 66% Plasma, 33% Melter, done. That makes it easier in a funny sort of way to build a list, because you haven't got loads of different choices. It's simple, it's straight, it's right down the middle of the road. It's a bit like Harlequins. Harlequins are really, really powerful, but they've only got 7 unit choices. Okay? And it's because if you've only got 7 unit choices, each one of those tends to just be good. And as long as they're not messed with, and as long as they're given solid capabilities, then they'll remain good. So that's kind of how I see it with Scions. Now, Another thing that I would say with Scions is that they've got a much, and this is a really important one, okay, they've got a much smaller footprint. So even with all the terrain on current 9th edition boards, you'll tend to find that guard armies are big. Okay, and even with all the points changes and whatnot, guard armies tend to field more models and more stuff than other armies out there. So, you know, you're going to be turning up to a battle with 7 or 8 vehicles. You know, between your chimeras and your full-pedal manticores and your, you know, maybe your sentinels and your tank commanders, you could easily be running, you know, 8 or 9 vehicles. And then on top of that, you're going to be running like what, 100 infantry, so, you know, in various forms, in various guises. So whatever your flavour of choice might be, you're going to be running like maybe a big block of Bulgrin as well. And my point is with this is that because of this, guard armies tend to have to spread out, and you can't take advantage of cover. You can have some things hidden out of line of sight, but you know, Leman Russes are big vehicles, Manticores are big vehicles, Bulgrins are big models. Infantry squads, you can't hide them all out of line of sight. And the reason I mention why this is so important is with Scions you definitely can do. When I'm playing my Scions, every tournament game that I go to, I hide all of my Torx Primes out of line of sight because I only have 5 of them, and they're like half the size of a Leman Russ. Their Torxes are really, really small. They're smaller than like Goliath trucks. They're tiny. Okay, they're like they're like a 60% the size of a Chimera, half the size of a Leman Russ, and that's really important because what I found in 9th edition 40k is it's so lethal. It's so lethal that anything that is left out in the open will just die. And I think that's like a real world rule. I can't remember who said it, but it was a famous, I'm sure it's like a famous World War II general or World War I general who was like, a target, no matter how heavily armoured, if out in the open, will die. That, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm probably butchering the quote, but the point of the quote is to say like cover and concealment is better than just being a massive, you know, armoured tank basically. And I definitely feel like that's the case in 9th edition. If this is from me being on the receiving end of that kind of firepower and me putting out that kind of firepower. You know, when my opponents have deployed things out in the open, my Torx Primes have had a field day. They have just started, those Gatling cannons have started whirring, and I've started picking up models by the handful. You know, my enemy has, I mean. And likewise, when I have exposed my Torx Primes, or my enemy's able to get an angle on them, they tend to die. You know, it tends to be quite lucky on my part, unlucky on my opponent's part. If a Torx Prime is exposed and it doesn't die, that tends to come down to dice more than anything else. Okay, so that's definitely something that Guard they struggle with because you often fill the majority of your deployment zone with a Guard army, and no matter what you do, you know, that means the enemy is going to have targets from turn 1. But the same can't be said about you. You know, it's very possible for your opponent to hide the majority of their stuff out of line of sight. And so maybe you'll have a couple of full payload manticores that'll get some shots off. Which, you know, that might be fine. But that's all you're really going to do with your turn 1 if you go first and your opponent's played cleverly. So it's a bit of an interesting one. So that's why I feel like I've been gravitating towards Scions and why I've been doing better with running my Scions than I have been with running my Guard. And another thing to say is that, you know, Scions play into the strengths of 9th edition, which is they have, you know, they're ballistic skill 3+ across the board, which you basically just need in 9th edition with all the crazy terrain and stuff out there. You tend to need it. With all the lines like blocking terrain, you can't. A Leman Russo going 5 inches might never have a target all game, or it might have few and far betweens. A Torx Prime going 14 inches a turn will always be able to find an angle because the small 40k is a smaller board now, even with dense terrain. You know, so it tends to be that I find that Scions play more into the strengths of 9th edition into the terrain. Now, one thing, however, this has some people are saying, "What should I just give up on my regular Guard?" Then no, there are a few things that regular Guard do very, very well, that Scions just can't really compete on. And the first one is, it's kind of a double-edged sword. We talked about being, having to spread out across the board a lot, but that kind of comes back, and it's almost funny because I would say regular guard has the potential for massive board control. Okay, massive board control. You can flood the board, and you can control serious amounts of objectives and table quarters and all that kind of good stuff with regular guard. And especially if you go down like the pure infantry guard route, where you're turning it with like 300 guys, and you're going to be in wherever you want to be every turn, because you've got things like move that just allow you to slingshot units across the board, and you're covering the whole board. You're just marching forward. So regular guard does have some advantages like that. There are also games, and again, this is more of a double-edged sword, but there are games that you can go into with your regular guard where literally you've won the game before dice has even been rolled, because the enemy simply isn't equipped to deal with what you're turning up with. So an example of this would be, if you've got an enemy army that, no one takes huge amounts of armor anymore, right? That's like, it's not very meta to take huge amounts of armor, and most people's heavy weapons are capping out at like strength 7 or strength 8. So at best, when they're targeting like a Lehman Russ, they're going to wound it on 4s, which isn't ideal for a lot of the time. Obviously AdMech are a bit of an exception to this, but we're talking the majority of enemy factions. And it's like, okay, so that means that if I turn it with a shitload of tanks, Guard can do a lot of like Skewlists. So it's like, if I turn it with a pure tank army, or should we say pure mechanized army, so you do have the ability to take objectives and do the maneuverability thing. You've got mechanized infantry backed up by a shitload of Lehman Russes. If you do that, then there'll be some armies which simply cannot deal with that level of armor. Just can't do it. And a good example of this is what I faced at my last event. I faced the 3 orc kill tank list, which was, no one was ready for 3 orc kill tanks. No one was ready for 3. Just that level of armoured overload. No one was ready for it. And that guy went 4-1. And the only reason he lost to me was he faced Scions, which were a niche arm, which had like 4 rerolls to wound against his vehicles because of elimination protocol sanctioned. And likewise, you can do the same thing with infantry. So there will be lists out there which simply do not have the volume of dice that even if every shot hits and wounds and like kills a guy, that they can physically table you. And you could just lean on the fact that, well, I'm turning up with 300 obsec bodies, and I'm just going to be on the objectives all game, and I'm going to be able to slingshot my men with move onto your home objectives. So you might max out the secondaries, but you literally get like 5 or 10 primary points. I have done that in a competitive setting to multiple people, okay, with my pure infantry guard in 9th edition, either in practice games or in that event that I went to with them, with my pure infantry guard. And there was a game where I faced off against an unkillable Dark Angels list where my opponent physically couldn't beat my army. He didn't have the firepower, he didn't have the damage out, but he couldn't do it. So what I'd say regular guard are very good at doing is, potentially they're very good at Skewlists. And Skewlists are, they do have the potential to go 3-2. They have potential to go 4-1. And the reason for this is, if you come across a complacent meta where people have turned up and they're just genuinely not ready for that much armor or that much infantry, and no one's ready for it, you'll smash everyone with like a skew list. Now that doesn't mean you'll go to the next tournament and the same thing will happen. You might go to the next one afterwards, and people were ready for the armor, and so you get absolutely crushed, or people were ready for the pure infantry and you just get tabled even though you've got 300 guys. But there is definitely, it cannot be dismissed or played down. Skew lists do have their place in 40k, and there are innumerable cases of people taking a list which would be considered a bit of a jank list, bit of a meme list, bit of a skew list, and smashing face with it and winning. This happened at the beginning of 9th edition when someone turned up with Gene Silicol with like 160 acolytes with hand flamers, and won 5-0 at a grand tournament with Gene Silical. Okay? Because it was a complacent meta. People were just not ready for it. There's a guy who recently, with Gene Silical, went 4-1 at a grand tournament because whilst his list wasn't overly skew, his faction was a skew faction. His faction was a niche faction, and people just hadn't factored it into their cogitators that Gene Silical were going to turn up and do all this tricksy shit. It's why I personally believe that my Scions did so well at that last event. People didn't take them into account. I wouldn't say it's my masterful generalship that allowed me to go, to go 3-1-1. I was practiced with the list. I'm not going to overly humble it down, but at the same time, apart from one person in that whole tournament, in my other who knew what I could do and beat me, the other games where I won or drew, my opponents didn't really know what Scions could do, and so they were at a disadvantage. I knew what their list could do, and they didn't know what my list could do. Okay, and Guard can still do that. Guard can still do that kind of trick because we're not that common at a tournament event. So, we'll basically leave the video here. There's how I would summarise this video is I would say Scions are a bit more take-all-comers. You're able to go into sort of any event with your good Scion list, with your Dakar Primes and with your Plasma and your Melter, and you're able to go into almost any game, unless you're facing them like a bogeyman, you've got a good solid chance of winning. Okay, you've got a good chance of pulling out a win with your Scion list. And you don't really have good or bad matchups, you just have games. With regular Guard, you can turn up, and what tends to happen is you have more good or bad matchups. You tend to have more, either you're the rock and they're using the scissors, or you're the rock and they're the paper. And so you tend to find that your ability to sort of compete kind of comes down to, has the enemy really prepared for my kind of skew list? Have people really prepared for that? Now, obviously, there are hybrid Guard lists which do really, really well. This is the last thing I'd say. Like, you have your solid Guard lists which are turning up, and you've got your block of Bulgrin, you've got your 3 tank commanders, you've got your 2 full pair Manticores, and you've got your your little Iotan Gorgons attachment, and you've got your regular Guard force. You've got those lists, and they do well as well. They do absolutely fine as well. But I tend to find that those kind of lists certainly have a ceiling, and those kinds of lists certainly they'll get you 3 and 2, but that's kind of as far as they'll get you. But like I said at the beginning of the video, it's totally possible. There are fantastic Guard players out there which are going 4-1 at events, which are going 3 and 2 at events, and they're doing really, really well. So Guard's not out of it yet. We just have to work. We have to work really hard for it, basically. Anyway, let me know what you guys think down. I know this has kind of been a bit of a rambling, meandering video, but this is just kind of my thoughts on the whole where our Guard at the moment, Guard versus Scions thing. What do you think down in the comment section below? How are you finding it? I tend to feel like the regular standard, just your average Joe Guard community players are struggling, and we are getting our faces smashed in a bit. And basically, if you want to run Guard, there's very few set paths you can go down to do well, which kind of sucks for a faction which has such high variety. That's how I tend to feel that the average sort of beer and pretzels players are feeling. And then when you go into the competitive scene, Guard can do okay, but you're relegated to either a skew list or one kind of hybrid list, which is your tank commanders, your Plague Load Manticores, and your Bulgrins. Or you've got your Scions, which is your Dakar Primes and whatnot. What do you guys think? Let me know. How have you been faring competitively, non-competitively? How have you been faring? And what are your thoughts on Guard versus Scions, and then Guard in the competitive scene, and then Scions in the competitive scene? Let me know what you guys are thinking. Thank you for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have enjoyed this video, please consider heading on over to the Patreon page. There will be a link down in the description below. And of course, a massive thank you to all of my current patrons. You guys are fantastic. It is thanks to your ongoing and just genuinely awesome support that I'm able to go to another event this weekend and down to London Grand Tournament and all that kind of stuff. It's thanks to your support that I'm able to keep this channel on the cutting edge of the meta with real Battlefield experience and not just stuff that's been read on the internet. So massive thank you to all my current Patreon supporters. Anyway, thank you for watching. Hope you've enjoyed it, and of course, I'll see you guys next time.